Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Luna, where history slows its pulse and mysteries unfold gently in the darkness. Tonight, we're going to sit with a question that hums quietly beneath the surface of everything we think we know about our past. What if the story of civilization is longer, deeper, and stranger than the textbooks suggest? What if humanity has been here, building and thinking and dreaming, far longer than we've been willing to admit? It's not a question that demands an answer tonight. It's the kind of thought that settles softly, like dust on old stones, waiting for you to notice it in your own time. We're not here to prove anything or convince anyone. We're here to wonder, to drift through possibilities, to let the mind wander slowly across landscapes of time so vast that our entire recorded history becomes just a momentary flicker in an immeasurably long sequence of moments. Where are you right now? Somewhere dark, perhaps. A quiet room, a warm bed, the faint glow of a screen the only light between you and sleep. Wherever you are, take a moment to think about the ground beneath you. Not just the floor or the foundation of your building, but the actual earth, the soil and stone that extends down through layers and layers of accumulated time. How many generations have walked over that same patch of earth, never knowing what lay deeper still, never imagining that beneath their feet might be the traces of lives lived thousands of years before their own? The planet keeps its memories in silence, compressed into strata that only reveal themselves when we learn how to read them, and tonight we're going to listen to what it might be trying to tell us, without hurry, without certainty, just with quiet curiosity. Because there's something about the night, about the act of listening in darkness, that changes how we understand things. The urgency that fills our daylight hours falls away. The need for immediate answers, for concrete solutions, for problems to be solved and boxes to be checked, all of it fades into something softer, something gentler. What's left is just space, quiet space where thoughts can move at their own pace, where ideas don't have to prove themselves or fight for attention. They can simply exist, floating through consciousness like clouds across a night sky, visible for a moment and then gone, but leaving an impression nonetheless. If you find this kind of slow, drifting exploration soothing, I'd be grateful if you gave this little corner of the internet a like, maybe subscribed, and helped it find its way to others who might be listening for the same gentle mysteries. Now, settle in, let your breathing slow. Let's step softly into history, not as students trying to memorize dates and names, but as travellers moving through a landscape that's older and quieter than any voice can fully capture. We're going to move through ideas the way fog moves through a valley, softly, without force, letting shapes emerge and fade, according to their own rhythm, never insisting, never demanding, just suggesting possibilities that you're free to accept or set aside as you wish. The quiet act of listening at night has its own particular rhythm, doesn't it? The world outside your window grows still, or if not entirely still, then at least different. The sounds that filled the day, the traffic and voices and constant hum of screens and machinery, all of it fades into something softer, something that feels almost like the absence of sound rather than sound itself. What's left is space. Not empty space, but space that's full of potential, full of room for thoughts to expand and connect in ways they can't during the crowded hours of daylight. History, when approached this way, doesn't need to be urgent. It doesn't need to prove anything or convince anyone. It can simply exist, the way a mountain exists, patient and unhurried, waiting for anyone who cares to look but not demanding attention, not insisting on being noticed or understood right now this instant. We're taught to think of history as a subject, something with chapters and tests and right answers, something you study in fluorescent-lit classrooms with timelines on the walls, showing the neat progression from one age to another, arrows pointing forward in an unbroken march toward the present. But maybe history is more like a conversation that's been going on for thousands of years, one we're only just beginning to overhear fragments of, catching words here and there without quite grasping the full context or meaning. The voices are faint, filtered through time and distance and the gradual erosion of everything humans make. But they're there if we listen carefully enough, if we're willing to sit quietly and let them come to us rather than trying to force them into clarity. And the thing about listening at night is that the darkness strips away distraction. There's nothing to see, or at least nothing that demands visual attention, so you're Other senses sharpen slightly. You hear things you wouldn't notice during the day. The settling of the building around you. The faint sounds from outside that are always there but usually drowned out. Your own breathing, your heartbeat when you're very still. The darkness creates a kind of sensory simplification that allows for a different quality of attention, something more inward, more receptive, less aggressive in its seeking. The same might be true for understanding the deep past. When we stop looking for what we expect to find, when we stop insisting that history must fit the shape we've already decided it should have, when we relax the grip of our assumptions just slightly, we might start noticing things that were always there but hidden by the glare of our certainties. The anomalies begin to stand out, the patterns that don't quite fit the established narrative, the structures that are older than they should be according to our timelines, the myths that align too precisely, with geological events to be dismissed as pure fantasy. None of it proves anything definitively, but all of it suggests that the story might be more complex, more layered, more strange and wonderful than the version we've been telling ourselves. The idea that human history might stretch back much further than we've assumed, that there might have been civilizations before the ones we know about, isn't new. It's a thought that's been whispered through myths and legends for as long as people have been telling stories around fires, passing knowledge from one generation to the next in the only form available before writing existed, before the relatively recent invention that allowed ideas to be frozen in symbols and carried across time without requiring an unbroken chain of human memory. Every culture seems to remember a time before this time, an age when things were different, when knowledge was greater, or at least different, when the world itself was somehow more alive, more filled with meaning and connection between the human and the cosmic. The Greeks spoke of golden ages that came before their own, perfect times of peace and prosperity that gradually declined through silver and bronze ages into the Iron Age they inhabited, each step down marked by a loss of harmony with the divine order. The Hindus described vast cycles of creation and destruction, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, each cycle containing its own complete rise and fall of civilization, its own journey from enlightenment to corruption and back again. The Maya counted time in epochs so enormous that our entire recorded history, everything from the first cities in Mesopotamia to the present moment, fits into what for them would be a single chapter of an ongoing cosmic story that stretches backward and forward through unimaginable spans of time. Maybe these stories are just metaphors, ways of imagining a past we can never truly know, attempts to make sense of the persistent feeling that something important has been forgotten, that we're walking through a world filled with echoes of knowledge that once existed but has been lost. Or maybe, just maybe, they're memories, distorted and mythologized as they pass through countless generations of retelling, filtered through different cultural lenses and religious frameworks, but memories nonetheless. Echoes of real events that happened so long ago that the details blurred into symbol and the geography dissolved into archetype, but the emotional truth remained, solid and persistent. The world was different once. People knew more. And then something happened, something catastrophic, something that broke the chain of transmission, and that knowledge was scattered or lost or had to be painfully reconstructed from fragments by later generations who didn't fully understand what they were rebuilding. When archaeologists first began seriously studying the ancient world in the 19th century, fresh from the excitement of deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs and excavating Mesopotamian cities, they created timelines that felt neat and comfortable, that aligned with the prevailing ideas about progress and human development that dominated Western thought during that era. Here's where agriculture began, they said, in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, when humans finally figured out how to cultivate plants and domesticate animals instead of wandering as hunter-gatherers. Here's the first city, Uruk or Jericho, depending on how you define the term and which archaeologist you ask. Here's writing, emerging in Sumer around 5,000 years ago, allowing for the first time in human history the recording of thoughts and events in a form that could outlast individual memory. Each milestone marked a step forward, a progression from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized, from ignorance to understanding. It's a story that makes sense, that fits with how we like to think about ourselves and our place in the long arc of human development. With the latest version, the most advanced, the culmination of a long, steady climb toward greater knowledge and capability. Each generation builds on the discoveries of the previous one, and slowly, patiently, Steadily, humanity ascends toward enlightenment. It's a reassuring narrative, one that tells us we're safe in our knowledge, that we understand where we came from, that the past is behind us and the future ahead, that we're moving in the right direction. But the more we dig, quite literally, the more those neat lines begin to blur and shift and refuse to stay where we've drawn them. Sites appear that are older than they should be according to the established timeline, forcing archaeologists to redraw their maps and reconsider their assumptions. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, for instance, that massive complex of carved stone pillars, arranged in carefully planned circles, was built more than 11,000 years ago by people who supposedly hadn't yet developed agriculture or permanent settlements, who, according to everything we thought we knew about human development, shouldn't have had the organisational capacity or the surplus resources or the motivation to create something so elaborate and apparently sacred. The structure predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the first cities by millennia. It shouldn't exist, not according to the story we've been telling about how civilization develops, about the necessary sequence of innovations that must occur in a particular order before humans can undertake large-scale construction projects. Yet there it is, weathered by time but undeniable, forcing a fundamental reconsideration of what humans were capable of in deep prehistory. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone anymore. Similar sites are being discovered in the region, each one pushing the timeline of complex construction further backward, each one suggesting that something more was happening during the last ice age than we ever imagined. There's a comfort in linear timelines, in the idea that history moves in one clear direction. They give us a sense of orientation, a feeling that we know where we came from and where we're going, that there's a shape to human development that we can understand and predict. Progress becomes not just a hope or an aspiration, but a fact, something written into the very structure of history itself, as inevitable as gravity or entropy. Each age improves on the last in this view. Each civilization learns from the mistakes of those who came before, building on their discoveries and avoiding their pitfalls. The story moves forward, always forward, from darkness into light, from superstition to science, from chaos to order, from ignorance to understanding. It's a reassuring narrative, one that tells us we're safe in our knowledge, that we've figured out the basic pattern, that the worst is behind us and the best is yet to come. But what if that's not quite right? What if history doesn't move in a straight line at all, but in something more like waves or spirals, rising and falling, building and collapsing, each cycle leaving traces for the next to find or forget depending on circumstances and luck, and the particular conditions under which those traces survive? What if the pattern is more complex than simple progress, more circular or spiral than linear, more like the cycles of nature, the seasons and tides, and the endless dance of creation and destruction that characterizes everything else in the natural world? Ancient cultures took this cyclical view for granted. They didn't see time as an arrow, but as a wheel, something that turns and returns, that moves through predictable phases of growth and decline, flourishing and decay. They saw it in the seasons, in the phases of the moon, in the daily cycle of sunrise and sunset, and they assumed, not unreasonably, that human affairs followed similar patterns. The Hindus spoke of yugas, vast ages of time during which the world rises through a golden age of perfection and prosperity, when humans live in harmony with divine law and each other, then gradually declines through silver, bronze, and iron ages, each one marked by increasing corruption and suffering and disconnection from cosmic order, before collapsing entirely and beginning the cycle again from a new golden age. Each complete cycle, they said, spans hundreds of thousands of years, maybe more, an almost incomprehensible stretch of time during which entire civilizations could rise, flourish, and disappear, leaving behind only the faintest traces for later ages to puzzle over. The Maya counted in baktuns, enormous cycles of creation and destruction, each marked by the appearance and disappearance of worlds and the beings that inhabited them. Their calendar wasn't just a way of tracking days and years, it was a cosmological system, a map of time itself showing how the universe moves through phases, how creation and destruction balance each other in an eternal dance. The Greeks had their own version, ages ruled by different races of beings, gods and titans and heroes and finally ordinary humans, each giving way to the next in a pattern of decline that would eventually, they hoped or feared, circle back to another golden age, another beginning. Even in the Bible, particularly in the philosophical books like Ecclesiastes, there's the sense that history isn't progressive but cyclical, that what has been will be again, that there's nothing new under the sun, that generations come and go like waves on a shore, but the earth remains forever, turning through its seasons and cycles regardless of what humans do or build or believe. Maybe these weren't just philosophical musings or religious doctrines designed to explain suffering or provide moral guidance. Maybe they were observations, patterns noticed over long stretches of time, conclusions drawn from seeing civilizations rise and flourish and then collapse only to have new ones emerge from the ruins generations later, building on the same principles, rediscovering the same knowledge, asking the same questions, following the same trajectory from innovation to stagnation to collapse. If that's true, if history really does move in waves rather than in a straight line of progress, then the version of civilization we're living in now, with all its technology and complexity and global reach, might not be the first. It might not even be the second or third or 10th. We might be the latest iteration in a pattern that's been repeating for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, each cycle building on the faint traces left by the last, each one believing itself to be the first, the unique, the unprecedented, when it's really just another turn of a very old wheel. The thought is humbling in a way that's not entirely uncomfortable. It suggests that we're not as unique as we'd like to believe, not the pinnacle of human achievement or the first to reach this level of understanding, but simply the current expression of something much older and more persistent than any single culture or era. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there's something comforting rather than diminishing in the idea that we're part of a pattern, that the struggles and triumphs we experience aren't ours alone but shared across time with people we'll never meet. People whose names are lost and whose languages have dissolved into silence, but whose presence still echoes faintly in the structures they left behind, in the myths that refuse to die completely no matter how modern we become, in the persistent human urge to build and question and understand our place in the cosmos. We're not separate from the past, standing on its shoulders and looking confidently forward into a future we're sure will be better. We're continuous with it, connected by threads we can barely see but can't quite ignore, part of the same conversation that's been going on since humans first looked at the stars and wondered what they were and what they meant and whether there was purpose or pattern in their movements. When we talk about civilization, we usually mean certain specific things, markers that we've agreed upon as signs of crossing some invisible threshold from one state of human existence to another. Cities, for one. The gathering of large populations in organised permanent settlements with division of labour and social hierarchies and specialised roles that free some people from the direct work of survival to pursue other activities like art or administration or the development of new technologies. Writing, the ability to record thoughts and events in a form that outlasts individual memory, that can be transmitted across space and time without requiring face-to-face contact or an unbroken chain of oral transmission. Technology, tools and techniques that allow us to reshape the world around us according to our needs and desires rather than simply adapting to the world as we find it. These are the markers we've agreed upon, the signs that tell us a culture has crossed some threshold from prehistory into history proper, from primitive to civilized, from simple to complex. But maybe those markers are too narrow, too specifically tied to our own experience of what civilization looks like. Maybe they reflect our own biases, our assumption that civilization must look like ours to count as civilization at all, that the only valid form of human organization is the one we happen to be living in. What if there were other ways to organize knowledge, to build societies, to leave marks on the world that would last? What if some of those ways left fewer traces, not because they were less sophisticated or less worthy of the label civilization, but because they worked with the planet's rhythms rather than against them, because they understood their place in the natural order differently than we do? The stone circles of Europe scattered across the landscape from Scotland to the Mediterranean don't require writing to exist, yet they demonstrate planning and coordination, an astronomical understanding that spans generations. Someone had to observe the sky carefully enough to know where the sun would rise on the solstice decades in the future. Someone had to organise labour to move stones weighing tons without metal tools or wheels. Someone had to maintain the knowledge across time, teaching the next generation why this work mattered, why these particular alignments were important, why the effort was worthwhile. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. The vast earthworks of the Amazon, only recently discovered through satellite imagery that can penetrate the jungle canopy, show geometric patterns that extend for kilometres, perfect circles and squares and lines that suggest urban planning on a scale that rivals anything in the ancient world. We thought the Amazon had always been pristine wilderness, untouched by human hands except for small, scattered tribes. Turns out we were wrong. There were cities there, extensive settlements with populations that might have numbered in the hundreds of thousands before European diseases decimated them. The jungle grew back, swallowing the evidence, and within a few generations the memory faded. If not for modern technology, we'd never have known they were there. The terraces carved into mountainsides across the Andes, creating microclimates that allow for agriculture at altitudes where it shouldn't be possible, demonstrate an understanding of ecology and engineering that modern agricultural scientists still study and struggle to replicate. None of these things required writing in the way we understand it, yet they all demonstrate planning, coordination, and understanding that spans generations. The people who built them knew something profound about their environment and how to work with it sustainably. Does the absence of written records make them less civilized? Or does it simply mean that their civilization expressed itself differently, in forms we're only beginning to recognize as intentional, as meaningful, as evidence of minds as curious and capable as our own? When you stand in front of a massive stone aligned perfectly to catch the sunrise on the winter solstice, you're not looking at primitive superstition. You're looking at astronomy, at generations of careful observation translated into permanent form, at a level of dedication and planning that required long-term thinking and social organization, and the transmission of specialized knowledge. That's civilization by any reasonable definition, even if it doesn't look exactly like ours. To understand how long humans might really have been here, building and thinking in ways we'd recognize as civilized if we knew where to look and how to interpret what we found, we have to step back from human timescales entirely. We have to think in terms of the planet itself, in what geologists call deep time, where 1,000 years is barely a moment and 1,000,000 years is still recent history, barely enough time for significant evolutionary change or geological transformation. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, give or take a few million years. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, anatomically identical to us in every way that matters, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That's a span of time so long that our minds struggle to grasp it. But in planetary terms, it's nothing, barely a blink. Try to imagine it. If the Earth's entire history were compressed into a single year, with the planet forming on January 1st, modern humans wouldn't appear until December 31st at about 11:57 in the evening. Recorded history, everything we think of as civilization, would occupy the last few seconds before midnight. We're that recent, that brief, that fleeting in the context of planetary time. Recorded history, the part where we have writing and cities and all the other markers we usually associate with civilization, covers maybe the last 6,000 years if we're being generous, and include the earliest Mesopotamian city-states and Egyptian kingdoms. That means 294,000 years of human existence happened before we started writing things down, before we left the kind of permanent records that historians can work with, before we began creating the documentation that allows us to say with confidence that we know what was happening in a particular place at a particular time. That's not a gap in our knowledge, that's a chasm. That's a length of time so vast that our entire recorded history could fit into it dozens of times over and still leave enormous blank spaces where anything might have happened. 294,000 years. Imagine living for 294,000 years. Imagine the things you would see, the changes you would witness, the rises and falls of cultures and societies and ways of organising human life. That's how long modern humans existed before we started keeping permanent records. And somewhere in that enormous stretch of unrecorded time, in those hundreds of millennia about which we know almost nothing except what can be inferred from scattered artefacts and the occasional skeleton, and the slow changes in tool styles, who knows what might have risen and fallen, built and been forgotten? We assume that because we don't have records of earlier civilizations, they must not have existed. We assume that the development of complex societies only happened once, in one place, around 6,000 years ago, and spread from there to other regions through contact and cultural diffusion. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when the evidence would have to survive conditions specifically designed to erase it, when the passage of time and the recycling of the planet's surface work constantly. to obliterate anything that isn't made of the most durable materials and preserved under the most fortuitous circumstances. The planet doesn't preserve things evenly or fairly. It keeps what happens to endure and erases the rest without sentiment or purpose, just as part of its ongoing process of renewal and transformation. Some materials last. Stone, under the right conditions and if it's not subjected to too much weathering or erosion, can survive for millions of years. Certain metals, if they're buried quickly and remain in an oxygen-poor environment where oxidation proceeds slowly, can leave traces for tens of thousands of years. Pottery, if it's broken and scattered, and then buried under sediment, can last indefinitely, which is why archaeologists love finding pottery shards, because they're one of the few things that reliably survive from ancient cultures. But most of what makes a civilization recognizable to us, the daily texture of life that would allow us to understand how people actually lived, the organic materials that humans use most and rely on most, the wood and fabric and paper and leather, all of that decays quickly. Within a few centuries, almost nothing remains but the hardest, most durable remnants. Within a few thousand years, even those begin to erode, to sink deeper into the soil, to be covered by vegetation and sediment that accumulates at rates measured in millimeters per year, but adds up significantly over the kind of timescales we're talking about. The planet recycles itself constantly, indifferent to what we might want, preserved, for future archaeologists to study. Mountains rise through tectonic uplift, thrust upward by the slow collision of continental plates moving at rates of centimeters per year, and then erode grain by grain over millions of years, worn down by wind and water and temperature changes until they're reduced to gentle hills and then to plains. Rivers change course, abandoning old channels and cutting new ones through different terrain, driven by earthquakes or landslides, or simply the gradual shifting of the landscape as some areas rise and others subside. Forests grow over ruins, their roots breaking stone and their fallen leaves and branches mixing with soil, until what was once a city becomes indistinguishable from natural landscape. Just another wooded hillside or jungle-covered mound that looks like nothing special, unless you know what to look for and have the technology to see beneath the vegetation. The ocean rises and falls with ice ages, claiming coastlines during warm periods when the polar ice melts, and exposing them again when the ice returns and locks up vast quantities of water, each cycle altering and erasing what came before, each advance and retreat of the shoreline destroying evidence or burying it under meters of marine sediment. It's not malicious. The planet isn't trying to hide anything from us or make our work difficult. It's just the way things work, the endless process of creation and destruction that has been going on since long before life existed on Earth and will continue long after, driven by forces that operate on timescales that make even geological epochs seem brief. If you wanted to hide a civilization, to make it almost impossible to find after enough time had passed, you couldn't do much better than simply letting the Earth do its work. Sediment accumulates at rates measured in millimeters or centimeters per century, gradually burying everything under layers of soil, turning what was once surface into subsurface, what was once visible into invisible. Glaciers advance and retreat, grinding stone to dust beneath their immense weight, scouring landscapes clean and depositing the debris in moraines that later generations might study without ever realizing what they're looking at. Tectonic plates shift, one subducting beneath another, pulling entire sections of crust down into the mantle, where they melt and are recycled into new rock that eventually rises again in volcanic arcs or mountain ranges, any trace of what existed on the surface long since erased. In a few million years, even our largest cities, our most impressive monuments, our most durable constructions would be reduced to chemical traces in sediment layers, subtle anomalies that might puzzle future geologists but wouldn't tell them much about who we were or what we built or what we believed or how we organized our societies. They might find a thin layer enriched in certain isotopes of carbon, evidence that something strange happened to the atmosphere during this period. They might find concentrations of synthetic materials that don't occur naturally, plastics and concrete and the byproducts of industrial processes. But they wouldn't find our cities. They wouldn't find our books or our art or any of the things we think of as defining who we are. All of that would be gone, erased by time and weather and the patient recycling of the planet's surface layers. The planet is patient in a way that makes human timescales seem almost frantic by comparison. It erases at its own pace, neither rushing nor delaying, not out of malice but simply as part of its nature. the same way a river wears down stone grain by grain or wind sculpts, sand dunes one particle at a time. Memory on Earth is written in layers, in strata of rock and sediment that geologists learn to read like pages in a book, and the deeper you go, the more compressed and distorted those layers become, the more difficult to interpret, until finally there's nothing left but the faintest suggestion that something once existed here. Patterns in mineral composition, or isotopic ratios that might mean something, or might mean nothing depending on how you interpret them and what you're willing to consider possible. There's a reason so many ancient myths around the world talk about floods. It's not because every culture independently invented the same symbolic story to represent the same archetypal fears or moral lessons. It's not because flood stories tap into some universal human psychology that makes them appear everywhere regardless of actual experience. It's because something real happened, something so dramatic and transformative that it left a mark on human memory deep enough to survive for thousands of years of oral transmission before being written down, deep enough that even now, millennia later, we still tell versions of the same story without always remembering why it feels so important, why it resonates so deeply. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and the planet began transitioning into the warmer interglacial period we're still living in, something dramatic happened. The vast ice sheets that covered much of North America, Northern Europe and Northern Asia, ice that in some places was miles thick, began to melt. Slowly at first, a gradual warming trend driven by changes in Earth's orbital parameters and the feedback loops of the climate system, but then in pulses, in sudden releases of water that geologists are still studying and debating, trying to understand the mechanisms and timings and consequences. Massive amounts of fresh water poured into the oceans, raising sea levels by more than 120 metres over the course of a few thousand years, which sounds like a long time but is actually remarkably fast in geological terms, fast enough that humans living through it would have noticed the changes within their own lifetimes, watched the sea advance year by year, generation by generation. That's as tall as a 40-storey building. Imagine the ocean rising that much. Entire landscapes, vast coastal plains that during the Ice Age were prime human habitat, offering resources and relatively mild climates and easy travel routes, disappeared beneath the waves. The coastlines we know today, the boundaries between land and sea that we think of as permanent features of geography, are completely different from what existed during the Ice Age. What's now open ocean or shallow continental shelf was once dry land where people might have lived for thousands of years, establishing cultures and traditions and ways of life we'll never know anything about unless we develop better ways of exploring the ocean floor and recognising what's worth investigating. The North Sea, that body of water between Britain and continental Europe, was once a habitable region called Doggerland, complete with rivers and forests and animals and presumably the humans who hunted them. It's gone now, submerged when the ice melted, existing only as a shallow area on nautical charts, and in the artefacts that fishermen occasionally dredge up in their nets, flints and bones and fragments of tools that testify to a lost world. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines formed a single landmass called Sunderland that might have supported significant populations before the rising seas, divided it into islands. The continental shelf off every coastline was dry land, some of it extending hundreds of kilometres beyond the present shoreline, prime real estate that's now underwater and largely unexplored. To anyone living through it, the rising of the seas would have felt apocalyptic, though perhaps in slow motion compared to the sudden catastrophes we imagine in disaster movies. Not a single wave cresting over the landscape and destroying everything in an instant, but a relentless advance of the ocean that wouldn't stop, that couldn't be fought or negotiated with or prayed away. The horizon creeping closer year by year, generation by generation, the tide line advancing inland at a rate that was sometimes barely perceptible, a few metres per century perhaps, and other times horrifyingly rapid, especially during the meltwater pulses when enormous ice dams failed and released vast lakes of glacial meltwater in geological instants, raising sea levels by metres in a matter of years or even months. Imagine what it would be like to watch your world drown. Not all at once, not with the mercy of sudden disaster, or at least it's over quickly, and you don't have to live with the anticipation, but slowly, relentlessly, over the course of a human lifetime or even longer, spanning generations so that children grew up knowing only retreat, only loss, only the constant awareness that what their grandparents had known was gone and what they themselves knew would not last much longer. The fields where your ancestors grew crops, places that had sustained your people for hundreds of generations, now underwater, unusable, lost forever beneath salt water that kills everything that once grew there. The villages where countless generations lived, celebrating births and mourning deaths, and passing down the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of years of careful adaptation to that particular landscape, gone beneath the tide, the houses and temples and meeting places and everything that made those places home submerged and scattered by currents. The hunting grounds and fishing spots and sacred places, the rivers and forests and landmarks that gave your life structure and meaning and connection to the land, erased as though they never existed, as though all those generations of careful attention and love and adaptation meant nothing to the indifferent ocean. The sea taking and never giving back, rising higher each year, claiming more territory, forcing you and your people to move again and again, always retreating, always losing ground, never able to stand and fight, because how do you fight the ocean? If you survived, if you made it to higher ground with whatever you could carry, the portable wealth and tools and seeds that might let you start again in unfamiliar territory, you'd carry those memories with you, etched as deeply as any physical scar. You'd tell your children what was lost, not just the material things, though those mattered, the homes and tools and accumulated possessions, but the places themselves, the geography of your identity, the landscape that shaped who your people were and how they understood themselves and their place in the world. And they'd tell their children, passing the story down through the generations, each retelling, simplifying and mythologizing slightly, focusing on the emotional core rather than the specific geography, because the geography kept changing as your people kept moving inland, kept fleeing the advancing waters, and over hundreds of retellings spanning thousands of years, the details would blur and fade. The specific names of places would be forgotten, because those places no longer existed and hadn't for so long that they'd become mythical rather than geographical. The precise sequence of events would be simplified into a single dramatic narrative. The scientific understanding of why it was happening, if there ever was one, would be replaced by religious or moral explanations, because those provided comfort and meaning where simple causality provided neither. But the core of the story would remain, persistent and haunting, and somehow more real than fiction, because it emerged from lived experience, even if that experience was now dozens of generations in the past, preserved in the collective memory of a people who couldn't afford to forget, even if they no longer understood exactly what they were remembering. The world was different once. It was better, more prosperous, richer in resources and possibilities. People lived in a land of plenty, whether you call it a golden age or a paradise or Eden, or simply a good place that sustained them without the constant struggle that later became necessary. And then the waters came, whether as punishment from angry gods or as natural disaster, or simply as the turning of some cosmic wheel that humans couldn't understand or control, and took it all away, drowned it, destroyed it, forced a new beginning in diminished circumstances in harder lands among people who had to relearn or rediscover or reinvent what had been lost. That's what flood myths might be. Not divine punishment invented by priests to scare people into obedience, not symbolic tales about the soul's journey through death and rebirth, not morality lessons disguised as natural disasters, but genuine memories of real events, of one of the most significant climate changes in recent human history, preserved in the only form available to people without writing, encoded in story and ritual and passed down through the generations, until the original event was so far in the past that it took on the quality of myth, but memory nonetheless, distorted and mythologized and simplified but fundamentally true in its essential claim that the world was once different and something catastrophic changed it and forced humanity to start again. The Mesopotamians told of Utnapishtim and his ark, the survivor of a flood that covered the land, chosen by the gods to preserve life and begin the world again after the waters receded. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written stories we have, preserved on clay tablets that archaeologists pieced together painstakingly from fragments found in ancient libraries buried under millennia of accumulated debris, describes the same event with details so specific and so similar to other flood narratives that it suggests the story was already ancient when it was finally written down, already standardized through countless retellings into a form that everyone recognized. The warning from the gods about coming destruction. the instruction to build a boat of specific dimensions and save his family and representatives of every living thing, the rising waters that covered even the mountains, that turned the world into an undifferentiated expanse of water with no land visible anywhere, the waiting, the uncertainty, not knowing if the waters would ever recede or if this was simply the new, permanent state of the world. The birds sent out to find land, returning the first time with nothing because everywhere was still water, then on a later attempt returning with signs of vegetation in their beaks, proof that somewhere land had emerged, and finally not returning at all because they'd found somewhere to settle, somewhere safe to build a nest. The mountain top where the vessel finally came to rest when the waters receded enough to reveal the highest peaks. The sacrifice of thanksgiving, offering gratitude to whatever powers controlled such things for the preservation of life and the possibility of beginning again. The promise, whether explicit or implied, that such destruction wouldn't happen again, or at least not in the same way, that this particular catastrophe was unique and unrepeatable, even though everyone knew on some level that the world remained dangerous and unstable and could change again in ways no one could predict or prevent. The Hebrews told essentially the same story about Noah, preserving it in the Torah and later the Christian Bible, where it would be read and retold and reinterpreted for thousands of years, spreading the narrative far beyond its origins in Middle Eastern oral tradition until it became one of the most widely known stories in human history. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the only humans to survive when Zeus flooded the earth to punish humanity for its wickedness, landing their boat on Mount Parnassus when the waters finally receded and repopulating the world through a strange ritual of throwing stones over their shoulders that transformed into people, a mythological addition that obscures but doesn't erase the core memory of catastrophic flooding. The Hindus described Manu, who was warned by a fish about a coming deluge that would destroy the world. The fish, actually the god Vishnu in disguise, though Manu didn't know it at the time, instructed him to build a ship and save himself and the 7 great sages who represented the accumulated wisdom of humanity and the seeds of all living things, so that when the water subsided, creation could begin again, life could be restored, the world could be repopulated with all its diversity. The details differ, but the pattern remains the same. Warning, preparation, flood, survival, renewal. Across the Pacific Ocean, separated from these Middle Eastern and Mediterranean and South Asian cultures, by vast distances and presumably no direct contact during the time when these stories were taking shape and being refined through countless retellings, indigenous peoples told their own versions that follow the same pattern. Australian Aboriginal traditions, some of the oldest continuous cultural narratives on Earth, speak of the sea rising and swallowing the land, of the time when what's now the coast was far inland, and the ancestor spirits walked a different landscape before the waters claimed it, and forced the people to retreat to higher ground, changing their entire way of life in the process. Native American tribes from different regions and different linguistic groups and different cultural backgrounds tell variations of flood stories, some involving boats similar to the Middle Eastern narratives, others involving caves or mountains where survivors took refuge while the world was washed clean, details varying widely, but the central theme remaining constant across hundreds of distinct tribal traditions. The flood came. Most perished. A few survived. The world began again. These aren't just similar stories that happen to involve water because water is a universal human concern, and floods are scary, and therefore make good subjects for cautionary tales. They're the same story, recognisably so even across vast cultural and linguistic divides, even accounting for the inevitable variations that occur when stories are retold and adapted to local contexts, and filtered through different religious and philosophical frameworks. They're the same story, told in different languages and shaped by different mythological traditions and interpreted through different cultural lenses, but pointing back to the same event or series of events, the same traumatic reshaping of the planet that happened when the last ice age ended and the seas rose to claim what they'd once given up, what humans had probably come to think of as permanent land because it had been dry for so long, for so many generations, that no one alive remembered it ever being otherwise, or could imagine it being different in the future. If civilizations existed on those drowned coastlines, and there's really no good reason to think they didn't, since coastlines are exactly where humans tend to settle, given the access to both marine and terrestrial resources, and the moderate climates, and the ease of travel and trade by water, then most of the evidence of those civilizations is now underwater, lost beneath the waves, buried under meters or even tens of meters of sediment that's accumulated on the sea floor over the past 12,000 years, scattered across continental shelves that we've barely begun to explore even with all our modern technology, our sonar and submersibles and satellite imagery that can penetrate water to reveal patterns on the sea floor. The ocean is vast beyond our ability to fully comprehend, deeper and stranger, and more full of secrets than the surface world, and it holds those secrets tightly, revealing them only reluctantly when we happen to look in the right place with the right equipment, and the willingness to take seriously what we're seeing, rather than dismissing it as natural formations or wishful thinking, or pattern recognition gone awry. Only in recent years, only in the last few decades really, with sonar mapping becoming more sophisticated and submersible technology, allowing longer and deeper dives, and satellite imagery improving, to the point where we can sometimes see through water and detect anomalies on the sea floor, have we started to glimpse what might lie beneath the waves, what stories the ocean might be holding for us if we knew how to ask the right questions and interpret the answers we're receiving. And what we're finding is strange and difficult to categorize. Structures that look too regular to be purely geological, too geometric, too consistently aligned with patterns that suggest intention rather than random natural processes. Terraces that might be ancient wave-cut platforms formed when sea level was lower, or might be something else, something artificial, something built. Walls that might be natural formations, the result of columnar jointing in volcanic rock, or differential erosion of stratified sediments, or might be the remnants of ancient harbours or coastal settlements, now submerged and degraded by millennia underwater, but still recognisable for what they were if you know what to look for. Alignments that might be coincidental, the result of random processes creating, apparent patterns the way clouds sometimes look like faces or familiar objects, or might be intentional, evidence of human design and purpose, of builders working to some plan that made sense at the time, even if we can't fully reconstruct what they intended. The debate continues, quiet and largely unresolved, with some researchers convinced they're seeing evidence of submerged civilizations, and others insisting it's all just pareidolia and wishful thinking, the human tendency to see meaningful patterns in randomness, to project intention onto natural processes because we're pattern-seeking creatures who evolved to spot meaningful signals in noisy environments, and sometimes we overdo it, seeing patterns that aren't really there, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But the fact remains, stubborn and undeniable, that we've explored more of the moon's surface than we have of Earth's ocean floor. We've mapped more of Mars than we have of the deep sea. The deep past might be right. There, directly beneath us, beneath the waves, waiting to be discovered if we knew where to look and how to interpret what we found, and were willing to take seriously the possibility that the timeline we've constructed might be incomplete. When you look at ancient monuments scattered across the world, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles of difficult terrain that presumably would have prevented easy contact between the cultures that built them, from the pyramids of Giza in Egypt to the stepped temples of the Maya in Central America, from the massive carved stones of Pumapunku in Bolivia to the megalithic circles of Avebury in England, from the precisely fitted blocks of Sacsayhuaman in Peru to the enormous platform stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, certain patterns begin to emerge that are difficult to explain away as pure coincidence or as the inevitable result of humans everywhere, independently arriving at the same solutions to the same problems. Alignments to stars and constellations, specifically to the points on the horizon where certain celestial objects rise or set at particular times of year. The Great Pyramid at Giza aligns almost perfectly with true north, achieving an accuracy that would be difficult even with modern surveying instruments, requiring either sophisticated understanding of astronomy or generations of patient observation and adjustment. The sides face the cardinal directions with such precision that the error is less than 1/10 of a degree. That's not approximate. That's intentional. That's the result of careful planning and measurement, and a level of dedication to accuracy that suggests the alignment mattered deeply to the builders, that it wasn't just decorative but somehow essential to the purpose of the structure. Alignments to the sun's position at solstices and equinoxes, marking the extreme points of the solar year and the moments of balance when day and night are equal length. Temples oriented so that sunlight, penetrates deep into interior chambers only on specific days, creating dramatic effects that modern tourists travel thousands of miles to witness, effects that required precise planning and calculation to achieve. Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, all demonstrate attention to celestial alignments that goes beyond simple observation to suggest systematic study of the heavens over long periods of time. The movements of celestial bodies tracked with precision that seems impossible without modern instruments, without telescopes to magnify distant objects and computers to model complex orbital mechanics. Yet somehow, ancient astronomers managed to predict eclipses and planetary conjunctions and other celestial events that require sophisticated mathematical understanding and long-term observation. The Maya calculated the length of the solar year to an accuracy that rivals our own. They tracked Venus's cycles precisely, they understood that celestial bodies move in predictable patterns that can be mapped and anticipated, and they encoded that understanding in their calendars and monuments. Geometric ratios that appear again and again in the proportions of structures and the relationships between different elements of architectural complexes. The golden ratio, that strange mathematical constant approximately equal to 1.618, that appears throughout nature in the spiral of nautilus shells and the arrangement of seeds in sunflowers and the proportions of the human body, found in everything from the dimensions of the Parthenon in Greece to the layout of the Great Pyramid in Egypt to temples in Asia and the Americas. It shows up so consistently in ancient architecture that it's hard to believe it's coincidental, yet we have no written records explaining why ancient builders favoured this particular proportion, or even whether they understood it as a mathematical relationship or simply as something that felt right, something aesthetically pleasing. Pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, encoded in dimensions and proportions in ways that suggest the builders understood this mathematical relationship, even if they didn't express it in the same symbolic form we use today, even if they didn't have the Greek letter we use to represent it. The height of the Great Pyramid divided by twice its base length gives an approximation of pi. The perimeter of the base divided by the height approximates the ratio between the circumference of a circle and its radius. These might be coincidences, or they might be evidence that the ancient Egyptians understood geometric relationships that we usually credit to the Greeks who came much later. Mathematical relationships that mirror the structure of the planet itself, ratios that correspond to the relationship between Earth's diameter and circumference, between the sizes of Earth and Moon, between distances in the solar system and orbital periods. Some researchers have suggested that the Great Pyramid encodes information about the planet's dimensions, that it's essentially a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, that its proportions contain knowledge about the size and shape of Earth that supposedly wasn't discovered until much later in history. These claims are controversial, debated, far from universally accepted, but they persist because the mathematical relationships are undeniably there, even if we can't agree on whether they're intentional or coincidental. Astronomical knowledge encoded not just in the alignments of structures, but in their very dimensions and the relationships between different parts of an architectural complex, creating what amount to three-dimensional models of celestial mechanics preserved in stone that would last long after any written records or oral traditions had faded. Calendars carved into architecture, not as decoration but as functional instruments for tracking time and predicting the seasons, essential information for agricultural societies that needed to know when to plant and harvest, but also perhaps serving purposes we don't fully understand, religious or astronomical or philosophical purposes that required precise measurement of time's passage. Observatories built to track the heavens with an accuracy that rivals our own until quite recently in human history, until the last few centuries when we developed optical instruments sophisticated enough to surpass what the ancients could achieve with careful naked-eye observation and geometric precision alone. But for thousands of years, ancient astronomers managed to map the sky and predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but stone structures as sighting tools and the patient accumulation of observations across generations. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated science practiced without the benefit of our technology, but achieving results that we can still verify and respect. These aren't isolated achievements belonging to one brilliant culture that figured something out and then vanished, leaving everyone else to start from scratch. They appear everywhere, in societies separated by oceans and millennia, in peoples who supposedly never had contact with each other, who didn't share language or writing systems or mythologies or religious frameworks, but somehow arrived at similar solutions to similar problems, similar ways of encoding knowledge in durable form, similar decisions about what mattered enough to preserve in monuments that would outlast generations. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe the explanation really is as simple as saying that humans everywhere just naturally gravitate toward the same patterns when faced with questions about time and space and our place in the cosmos. Maybe the ability to notice solstices and track lunar cycles and recognize that certain stars appear in certain positions at certain times is so fundamental to human cognition, so deeply wired into how our brains work, that it emerges independently wherever people settle and start paying attention to the rhythms of the natural world. Maybe the appearance of similar geometric ratios is just an inevitable consequence of working with certain materials and trying to meet certain structural requirements. Nothing more mysterious than convergent evolution, producing similar solutions to similar problems in biology. Or maybe there's something else going on, something more interesting and more strange that we're only beginning to glimpse through the steady accumulation of archaeological discoveries that don't quite fit our models, that push the boundaries of what we thought was possible or likely, that force us to reconsider assumptions we didn't even realize we were making. Maybe knowledge doesn't just appear spontaneously wherever humans gather in sufficient numbers and develop the leisure to contemplate abstractions and work on projects beyond immediate survival. Maybe it gets passed, down, inherited from earlier sources, transmitted across time through mechanisms we don't fully understand because writing and formal education are such recent innovations in human terms, and we assume they're the only ways to preserve and transmit complex information when maybe they're just the most obvious to us because they're what we use. Maybe knowledge can survive in other forms that we're only beginning to recognize and take seriously. In mythology, that encodes astronomical data within narrative frameworks, using stories about gods and heroes to preserve observational information about celestial cycles and planetary movements. In architectural traditions that preserve geometric relationships and proportional systems without explicitly explaining why those particular ratios matter or where they came from. In ritual practices performed at specific times and in specific ways that maintain precise observations across generations without anyone necessarily articulating the underlying principles or understanding the full significance of what they're doing. In the proportions of sacred structures that feel right without anyone quite remembering why those particular dimensions were chosen or what they represent. The knowledge persists even when conscious understanding fades, passing from one civilization to another across gulfs of time so vast that the original source is lost and the connection broken, but the pattern remains, waiting to be recognized again when someone looks closely enough and asks why these ancient builders, these supposedly primitive people without our technological advantages, somehow knew so much about the cosmos and encoded that knowledge in ways we're only now learning to read. And so we come back, full circle, to where we began, to the quiet of the night and the space it creates for wondering, to the questions that don't have easy answers but feel worth asking anyway, to the possibility that history is deeper and stranger than we've been taught, that civilization might be older than we think, that the patterns we see connecting ancient sites across the globe might not be coincidence at all, but evidence of something we haven't fully understood yet. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, open to interpretation, but it's there, in the myths that refuse to die, in the monuments that still stand after millennia, in the persistent feeling that we're missing something, that there's more to the story than we've been told. The night is deep now. Your thoughts have probably slowed, drifting between waking and sleep, between the certainties of what you know and the mysteries of what you don't. And maybe that's exactly where this kind of exploration should leave you. Not with answers, but with questions. Not with certainty, but with possibility. Not with conclusions, but with an invitation to keep wondering, to keep looking, to remain open to the idea that the past is not as settled as we like to think. The Earth keeps its secrets, in layers of stone and sediment, in structures scattered across continents, in stories passed down through countless generations until their origins blur into myth. We've only just begun to learn how to read what it's trying to tell us. The conversation between past and present continues, quiet and patient, waiting for anyone willing to listen without demanding immediate answers, without insisting that everything fit neatly into the categories we've already established. History doesn't owe us clarity. It doesn't need to resolve into simple narratives with clear beginnings and satisfying endings. It can remain incomplete, ambiguous, full of gaps and contradictions and maybes. And perhaps that's not a failure of our understanding, but recognition of something important. That the past is vast enough to contain more possibilities than any single explanation can capture. That certainty about events that happened thousands of years ago might be less honest than admitting what we don't know. That the mystery itself might be worth preserving. Not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an invitation to remain curious, to keep exploring, to accept that some questions may never be fully answered, and that's okay. Sleep well. Let these thoughts dissolve like mist when morning comes. And if you wake with a lingering sense of wonder about the deep past, about the possibility of forgotten ages and lost knowledge and patterns we're only beginning to recognize, that's enough. That's all history really asks of us. Not certainty, but curiosity. Not answers, but the willingness to keep asking questions. The past is patient. It will still be there tomorrow, waiting quietly in the darkness, ready to reveal its secrets to anyone who takes the time to listen. Until next time, this is Sleepy Luna, where history moves slowly and mysteries unfold in their own time. Rest easy. The questions will keep. Sweet dreams. The thing about patterns is that once you start seeing them, it becomes difficult to unsee them. Your mind begins connecting things that might not be connected, or might be connected in ways you don't fully understand yet. It's a delicate balance, this business of pattern recognition. Too much skepticism, and you miss genuine connections. Too much eagerness, and you see connections that aren't really there. The ancient monuments scattered across the globe might all point to a single source of knowledge now lost, or they might simply reflect the fact that humans everywhere face similar challenges and sometimes arrive at similar solutions independently. Both explanations have merit. Neither can be proven definitively with the evidence currently available. What we can say with more certainty is that the people who built these structures were paying attention. They were observing their world carefully, noting patterns, testing ideas, refining techniques across generations. They weren't primitive in any meaningful sense of that word. They were curious, capable, dedicated to projects that would outlast their individual lives. That takes a particular kind of thinking, a willingness to work toward goals you'll never personally see completed, trusting that future generations will carry on the work and understand its importance. Modern society struggles with that kind of long-term thinking. We're focused on quarterly reports and election cycles, on immediate results and quick returns. The idea of starting a project that won't be finished for centuries seems almost alien to us. Yet that's exactly what ancient builders did. They planted trees they'd never see mature. They carved stones they'd never see placed. They aligned structures to astronomical events they'd never witness. That's not primitive. That's visionary in ways we've perhaps forgotten how to be. When archaeologists excavate ancient sites, they're always aware of how much has been lost. For every artifact that survives, thousands don't. For every structure that remains standing or recognizable, countless others have crumbled into dust or been cannibalized for building materials by later peoples who had no idea what they were dismantling. We're working with fragments, trying to reconstruct wholes from pieces so scattered and incomplete that sometimes we're not even sure what we're looking at. It's like trying to understand a book when 99% of the pages are missing. You might figure out the general theme, you might even reconstruct parts of the plot. But huge sections will remain mysterious, and you'll never be entirely sure whether your reconstruction matches what the author actually intended. That's the situation with ancient history. We have fragments, hints, suggestions, but enormous gaps that can only be filled with educated guesses and careful extrapolation from the limited evidence available. And yet, despite these limitations, or perhaps because of them, the past continues to fascinate us. We keep digging, keep analysing, keep refining our understanding, based on new discoveries and new technologies that let us see things our predecessors couldn't. Each generation of archaeologists and historians builds on the work of those who came before, slowly expanding the boundaries of what we know, pushing back the darkness just a little bit further, revealing corners of the past that had been hidden for millennia. Sometimes the discoveries are dramatic. A new tomb is found, its contents intact, offering a rare glimpse into lives lived thousands of years ago. A new technique reveals hidden chambers in structures we thought we understood completely. Satellite imagery shows patterns on the ground that suggest settlements in places we thought were uninhabited. These moments of discovery feel like conversations across time, like the past reaching out to touch the present, offering us insights we didn't have before. But more often, the work is slow and incremental. A pottery shard here, a tool fragment there, each tiny piece adding slightly to our understanding without revolutionizing it. The patient accumulation of small details that gradually coalesce into larger pictures. It's unglamorous work, requiring years of training and dedication and a willingness to spend enormous amounts of time on questions that might never be fully answered. Yet people do it anyway, driven by curiosity, by the desire to understand where we came from and who we are and how we got here. The question of whether earlier civilizations existed before the ones we know about remains open. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The myths are persistent but ambiguous. The monuments are impressive but subject to multiple interpretations. We can't say with certainty that there were advanced societies tens of thousands of years ago that left traces we're only now beginning to recognize. But we also can't say with certainty that there weren't. The absence of definitive proof isn't proof of absence, especially when we're talking about timescales so vast that erosion and geological recycling would have erased most evidence anyway. What we can say is that the timeline of civilization keeps being pushed backward. What we thought was the beginning turns out not to be. What we assumed was impossible for people of a certain era turns out to have been accomplished. The story keeps getting more complex, more layered, more interesting, and that suggests we should remain humble about our conclusions, open to revision, willing to adjust our understanding as new information becomes available. The deep past is patient. It's been waiting for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer for us to develop better tools, better questions, better ways of interpreting what we find. In the meantime, we can sit with the uncertainty, with the not knowing, with the possibility that the story is bigger than we've imagined. We can let ourselves wonder without needing immediate answers. We can contemplate the vastness of time and our brief place within it, without feeling diminished by that recognition. Because there's something liberating about accepting how much we don't know. It takes the pressure off. We don't have to have everything figured out. We don't have to defend positions we're not entirely sure about. We can simply observe, question, wonder, and remain open to whatever understanding emerges from continued investigation and thought. The past will reveal what it's willing to reveal in its own time, according to its own logic. Our job is just to pay attention and try to understand what we're being shown. The silence of deep time is not empty. It's full of voices we're only learning to hear, stories we're only beginning to piece together, patterns we're only starting to recognize. Each generation adds to that understanding, contributes to the ongoing conversation between past and present. We're part of that process now, part of the long chain of humans trying to understand who we are by understanding who we were. It's meaningful work, even when the answers elude us. Maybe especially when the answers elude us, because then we're forced to remain humble, to keep questioning, to avoid the trap of thinking we've figured everything out. The night deepens around you. Your thoughts have probably drifted far from where we started, following tangents and possibilities, exploring ideas without trying to pin them down too precisely. That's good. That's the right way to approach these questions. Not with aggressive certainty, but with gentle curiosity. Not demanding answers, but allowing patterns to emerge in their own time. History isn't something we conquer or master. It's something we participate in, something we're part of whether we realize it or not. Every day we live adds to the historical record that future archaeologists might study. Every structure we build, every artifact we create, every thought we record becomes part of the material they'll work with, trying to understand what we were like and what mattered to us and how we understood our world. We're making history right now, in this moment, though it probably doesn't feel that way. It feels ordinary, routine, just another night among thousands. But someday, if anyone remembers us at all, this will be the ancient past. This will be the deep time they're trying to understand. What will they make of us? What will survive from our civilization for them to find and puzzle over? What stories will they tell about us, mixing memory and imagination the way we do with our own ancient past? Will they understand us accurately, or will we become mythologized, simplified, turned into archetypes that serve their purposes rather than reflecting our reality? There's no way to know. We can only live our lives, do our work, hope that something meaningful survives, and trust that future generations will approach our remains with the same mixture of curiosity and humility that the best archaeologists bring to their work today. The cycle continues. Civilizations rise, flourish, decline, fall. Knowledge accumulates, gets transmitted, sometimes gets lost, gets rediscovered. Each generation thinks it's figured something out that no one before them understood, only to discover that the ancients knew more than we gave them credit for, that wisdom isn't the exclusive property of any particular era, that intelligence and curiosity and the desire to understand have been human constants for as long as humans have existed. We're not so different from the people who built Göbekli Tepe, or aligned Stonehenge with the solstices, or carved the massive stones at Sacsayhuaman. We have more technology, more accumulated knowledge recorded in forms that don't depend on individual memory, but the same basic drives. We want to understand. We want to create. We want to leave something behind that matters. We want our lives to mean something beyond the brief span of years we're given. That urge to meaning, to significance, to connection with something larger than ourselves, that's what drives the creation of monuments. That's what motivates the long-term projects that span generations. That's what keeps us wondering about the past and planning for the future, even though we know, on some level, that everything we build will eventually crumble and be forgotten. We build anyway. We create anyway. We think and question and wonder anyway, because that's what humans do. It's what we've always done, across hundreds of thousands of years, regardless of what other circumstances we found ourselves in. The past doesn't judge us for not understanding it completely. It doesn't demand that we figure everything out or that we draw definitive conclusions from incomplete evidence. It simply exists, layered beneath the present, available to anyone willing to look, to dig, to question, to remain open to possibilities. Some of those possibilities will turn out to be real. Others will prove to be mirages, patterns we thought we saw that weren't actually there. That's okay. That's part of the process. We learn by exploring, by testing ideas, by remaining willing to be wrong and adjust our understanding accordingly. The Earth continues its patient work of preserving and erasing, keeping some things and letting others go according to logic we can only partly understand. The monuments continue standing, silent witnesses to questions we're still formulating. The myths continue circulating, carrying memories whose origins we can only guess at. And we continue wondering, continue exploring, continue trying to piece together the story of who we've been and how we got here. It's good work, this wondering. It connects us to something larger than our individual lives, larger than our particular moment in time. It reminds us that we're part of a continuum that stretches back further than we can see, and forward into a future we'll never witness. We're not alone in our curiosity. We're part of a long line of questioners and seekers and wanderers, all trying to understand the same basic mysteries that have puzzled humans since we first became capable of abstract thought. Where did we come from? Who were the people before us? What did they know? What was lost? What survived? These questions don't have simple answers, but they're worth asking anyway. They're worth sitting with, worth contemplating in the quiet hours, worth carrying with us as we move through our days. They make us more thoughtful, more humble, more aware of our place in the vast sweep of time. And so, as sleep approaches, as consciousness begins to fade and thoughts dissolve into dreams, we can let these questions rest. Not answered, but acknowledged. Not solved, but appreciated. The mysteries of the past will still be there tomorrow. The patterns will still be there. The monuments will still be standing, silent and patient, waiting for the next person curious enough to look closely and wonder what they mean. The earth turns beneath us, carrying its memories in layers of stone and soil. The stars wheel overhead, tracing the same patterns ancient astronomers studied and encoded in their sacred structures. And somewhere in the space between what we know and what we don't, between certainty and mystery, between the past that was and the future that will be, we rest, comfortable with not knowing, peaceful with ambiguity, content to wonder without needing immediate answers. This is history at its gentlest, not demanding, not urgent, not insisting on conclusions, just present, available, rich with possibilities, the way it should be approached on quiet nights when sleep is near and the mind is free to drift wherever curiosity leads. Let it drift. Let the questions float through consciousness without trying to answer them. Let the patterns emerge and fade without forcing them into meaning they might not have. Let the past be mysterious, because mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a space to inhabit, a place where wonder lives. Until next time, this is Sleepy Luna, where history moves at the speed of sleep and mysteries unfold in the darkness. Rest well. Dream gently. The past is patient, and so are we. Good night. There's a particular quality to the silence that surrounds ancient places. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of patience, of time accumulated. When you stand among ruins, even ruined ruins, even stones so weathered and scattered that they barely resemble structures anymore, you can feel it. The weight of years. The presence of all the people who passed through this same space when it was new, when it served its purpose, before time reduced it to what it is now. That feeling isn't mystical, though it might seem that way. It's just the awareness of duration, of the vast stretch of time that separates their moment from ours. And if we find that awareness stirring when we encounter ruins from known civilizations, cultures we can name and date and read about in books, how much more profound might that feeling be if we encountered traces of something truly ancient? Something from before the beginning of recorded history? Something that predates our categories and classifications, that doesn't fit neatly into the timeline we've constructed? The silence would be deeper, the mystery more complete. The recognition that we're standing at the edge of something we don't fully understand would be inescapable. Maybe that's what draws people to these questions, to the possibility of lost civilizations and forgotten ages. Not proof or certainty, but that edge feeling, that awareness of standing at the boundary between what we know and what we don't. It's uncomfortable in some ways, that not knowing. We're creatures who like explanations, who want the world to make sense, who construct narratives that give events meaning and order. But it's also exciting. It's alive in ways that certainty never is. When you know something, really know it beyond doubt, it becomes fixed, static, closed to further discovery. But when you wonder, when you remain open to possibilities, the world stays dynamic. Anything might be true. Any new discovery might change everything. That's the space we're inhabiting tonight. That edge between knowing and wondering, between the established narrative and the possibilities that exist just beyond its boundaries. It's not a comfortable space, necessarily. It requires holding multiple ideas at once, some of them contradictory. It requires accepting that our current understanding might be incomplete, without claiming to know exactly what's missing or how to fill those gaps. It requires humility, the willingness to say we don't know and might never know for certain, but that the question itself is still worth contemplating. The academic establishment sometimes struggles with this kind of uncertainty. Careers are built on expertise, on being able to make definitive statements backed by evidence and peer review. The incentive structure rewards certainty, or at least the appearance of it. You can't get funding to study questions that don't have clear methodologies for reaching answers. You can't publish papers that conclude with maybe. The system demands conclusions, even when the evidence is ambiguous, even when multiple interpretations are equally valid, even when the honest answer is that we simply don't have enough information to be sure. But outside that formal structure, in the quiet hours, in conversations among friends, in moments of private reflection, people can wonder more freely. They can consider possibilities without needing to defend them as established fact. They can hold ideas lightly, testing them, seeing how they feel, discarding them if they don't hold up to scrutiny, but not needing to make grand pronouncements either way. This kind of wondering doesn't produce papers or advance careers, but it keeps curiosity alive. It maintains the flexibility of thought that allows new ideas to take root when conditions are right, and sometimes those casual wonderings turn out to point towards something real. Ideas that seemed fringe or speculative eventually gain evidence, gain support, gain acceptance. The timeline of human civilization has been rewritten multiple times in the past century as new discoveries forced reconsiderations of what we thought we knew. Göbekli Tepe was discovered in the 1960s, but not properly excavated until the 1990s, and when its age was established, it overturned assumptions about what hunter-gatherers could accomplish. The submerged structures off various coastlines are still being debated, but each dive brings new data, new images, new reasons to take the possibility seriously. The process is slow, science moves cautiously as it should. Wild speculation helps no one, but neither does reflexive skepticism that rejects new ideas simply because they don't fit the current paradigm. The balance is difficult to maintain. You want to be open to possibilities while also being rigorous about evidence. You want to question assumptions while also respecting the accumulated work of generations of scholars. You want to wonder while also being honest about what can and can't be known based on available information. That's the tightrope we're walking. Not claiming to have answers, but not dismissing the questions either. Acknowledging that the evidence for earlier civilizations is suggestive rather than conclusive, ambiguous rather than clear, but also acknowledging that absence of definitive proof isn't the same as proof of absence. The truth might lie somewhere we haven't looked yet, or somewhere we've looked but didn't recognize what we were seeing, or somewhere that's been erased so completely that we'll never find it. All of these are possible. None can be ruled out definitively. What we can do is continue paying attention, continue exploring, continue developing better tools and techniques for investigating the past, continue being willing to revise our understanding when new evidence warrants it, continue holding our conclusions lightly enough that we can let them go if they turn out to be wrong. This is how knowledge advances, not through stubborn adherence to established narratives, but through flexible engagement with whatever evidence emerges, wherever it points. The night is very deep now. You've been listening for a while, letting these thoughts wash over you, following them where they lead without trying to force them into final conclusions. That's good. That's the right approach for questions like these. The past will reveal what it's ready to reveal, in its own time. Our job is just to remain attentive, curious, open, to notice patterns without insisting on premature interpretation, to wonder without needing immediate answers, to accept that some mysteries might remain mysterious, and that's okay. The not knowing is part of the experience, part of what makes history feel alive rather than dead. Tomorrow, when you wake, these thoughts will likely have faded into the background, dissolved like dreams often do, leaving just a residue, a lingering sense of possibility. That's enough. You don't need to carry all these ideas forward with you. You don't need to become an amateur archaeologist or dedicate your life to proving theories about ancient civilizations. The wondering itself is valuable. The willingness to consider possibilities beyond the conventional narrative, that's what matters. It keeps your mind flexible, open, ready to incorporate new information when it appears. And who knows? Maybe someday, in your lifetime or long after, someone will make a discovery that changes everything. We'll find evidence so clear and compelling that the existence of earlier civilizations becomes undeniable fact rather than intriguing possibility. We'll uncover structures beneath the ocean, or artifacts buried beneath ice, or written records preserved in conditions that somehow protected them from the usual forces of decay. We'll connect enough dots that the pattern becomes unmistakable, that the scattered hints coalesce into a coherent picture of what came before. Or maybe not. Maybe the evidence is simply gone, erased beyond recovery, leaving us with nothing but myths and monuments and the feeling that we're missing something. Maybe we'll never know for certain whether the golden ages described in ancient texts were real or metaphorical, whether the aligned structures across continents reflect shared knowledge or independent discovery, whether the precision of ancient astronomy suggests inherited wisdom or remarkable achievement by people working without the benefit of what came before. Either way, the questioning matters, the wondering matters, the willingness to remain open to possibilities, that matters. It's what separates curiosity from dogma, what keeps us learning and growing and adjusting our understanding as new information emerges. The moment we decide we have everything figured out, we stop being able to see what's actually there. We start seeing only what we expect to see, fitting everything into predetermined categories, dismissing anomalies as errors rather than clues to something we haven't understood yet. So we stay curious, we stay humble, we stay open. We acknowledge the vastness of what we don't know while appreciating the limited things we do. We hold our certainties lightly and our questions seriously. We wonder without demanding answers, explore without requiring conclusions, contemplate without needing to prove anything to anyone. This is how we honour the past, not by claiming to understand it completely, but by acknowledging its depth and complexity and the limitations of our ability to fully reconstruct what happened in time so distant that most evidence has vanished. The earth continues its slow work. Mountains rise and fall, Rivers carve new channels, coastlines advance and retreat, and somewhere in all that patient geological transformation, the traces of what we will get folded into the planet's memory, preserved or erased according to processes we can study but never fully control. Future archaeologists, if there are any, will face the same challenges we do. Incomplete evidence, ambiguous artifacts, stories whose origins are lost. They'll piece together what they can and wonder about the rest, just as we do with our own deep past. It's humbling, this recognition of our limitations, but it's also liberating. We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to defend positions we're not entirely certain about. We can simply acknowledge what we know, admit what we don't, and remain curious about the space between. The past doesn't demand that we understand it completely. It just asks that we pay attention, that we look carefully, that we remain open to seeing what's actually there, rather than what we expect or want to see. And in that spirit of openness, of curiosity without demanding certainty, we can let these questions rest for now, not answered, but acknowledged, not solved, but appreciated for their complexity and depth. The mysteries of deep time will still be there tomorrow and the day after and all the days to come. They're patient, they can wait, they've been waiting for millennia already. What's a few more days or years or lifetimes in the context of geological time? Your breathing has slowed even further. Your thoughts are fragmenting, becoming less linear, more dreamlike. This is natural. This is the transition into sleep that we've been moving toward all along. The questions we've been exploring have served their purpose, creating space for your mind to wander without the usual demands of daytime consciousness. Now they can fade, dissolving like smoke, leaving just a faint impression that you might remember or might not, depending on how deeply you sleep and what dreams come. The past recedes into silence again. The monuments stand quiet under their respective stars. The myths wait in books and oral traditions, ready to be told again when someone asks. The patterns remain in the architecture, patient and permanent, whether anyone notices them or not. And we, brief visitors to this moment in time, transition from waking to sleeping, from questioning to dreaming, from wondering to resting. This is where we leave it then, on the edge of sleep, in the space between awareness and unconsciousness, between the certainties of day and the mysteries of night. The questions remain open, the possibilities remain alive, the past remains vast and largely unknowable, but present somehow in the very ground we stand on, in the stories we still tell, in the persistent human urge to understand where we came from and who we are. Sleep well, dream deeply, let the past keep its secrets for now. Tomorrow is soon enough to start wondering again. Until next time, this is Sleepy Luna, where history moves at the speed of sleep and mysteries unfold in the darkness. The questions will keep. The past is patient, and so are we. Rest easy now. Good night. The relationship between time and memory is stranger than we usually consider. We think of memory as something that belongs to individuals, to minds, to consciousness. But maybe memory is more distributed than that. Maybe it exists in places as much as in people. The landscape remembers in its own way. The shape of valleys carved by ancient rivers that no longer flow. The composition of soil enriched by forests that fell millennia ago. The alignment of magnetic particles in rocks that preserve information about the Earth's magnetic field at the moment those rocks solidified. This is memory without consciousness, without intention, but memory nonetheless. When we walk through old places, places where humans lived and worked and died for generations, we're moving through layers of accumulated memory. Not just our own memories, or the memories we've inherited through stories, but the memory of the place itself. The worn stones that show where countless feet walked the same path. The grooves in rock where ropes rubbed as people drew water from wells. The buildings adapted and modified by successive generations, each leaving their mark, each adding to the palimpsest of human presence. These traces speak if we know how to listen. They tell stories about daily life, about the rhythms of existence, about what mattered to people whose names we'll never know. And if places can hold memory in this way, then perhaps the greatest mystery isn't whether earlier civilizations existed, but how much of their memory still surrounds us, unrecognized, woven into the landscape in ways we haven't learned to read yet, the oddly regular formations that might be natural or might not, the alignments that might be coincidence or might be purposeful, the myths that might be pure imagination, or might be garbled recollections of something real. All of it potentially memory, potentially meaningful if only we could decode it properly. But decoding requires patience. It requires spending time with uncertainty, sitting with ambiguity, resisting the urge to force premature conclusions. This is difficult for us. We want answers. We want things decided, settled, known. The not knowing creates anxiety, a sense of intellectual incompleteness that demands resolution. So we construct explanations, create narratives that feel satisfying, even if they're not entirely warranted by the evidence. We tell ourselves stories about the past that make sense to us, that align with our expectations, that confirm what we already believe. And in doing so, we might be missing what's actually there, the genuine strangeness that doesn't fit our categories. The past is genuinely strange. The further back you go, the stranger it becomes, not because ancient people were fundamentally different from us, but because the context was so different that their choices and priorities can seem alien, incomprehensible, until you spend enough time with the evidence to start seeing the patterns, start understanding the logic that guided them. They weren't irrational or primitive. They were responding to different circumstances, working with different resources, prioritizing different concerns. Once you understand that, once you can see the world through their eyes even a little bit, their choices start making sense. But that understanding takes work. It takes willingness to set aside your own assumptions and really engage with the evidence on its own terms. It takes humility, the recognition that your first interpretation might be wrong, that what seems obvious might not be, that the past won't necessarily cooperate with your desire for simple explanations. The best archaeologists and historians develop this quality over decades of work, learning to hold their conclusions lightly, to remain open to revision, to treat every discovery as a question rather than an answer. For those of us who aren't professional, scholars who engage with these questions as interested amateurs, the challenge is similar but perhaps even more difficult. We don't have the years of training, the deep familiarity with evidence and methods, the context that comes from immersion in the field. We're working from popular accounts, from documentaries and books written for general audiences, from fragments and summaries rather than the full complexity of scholarly debate. It's easy to develop strong opinions based on incomplete information. It's easy to become convinced of theories that appeal to us emotionally or aesthetically without fully understanding the arguments against them. That's not necessarily bad. Enthusiasm for the past, even when it's not rigorously scholarly, can be valuable. It keeps people interested, keeps them asking questions, keeps the broader public engaged with archaeology and history in ways that might not happen if the field were entirely closed off to non-specialists, but it does require a certain self-awareness, a recognition of the limits of amateur understanding, a willingness to defer to expertise while still maintaining independent curiosity. The balance is tricky. You don't want to be so credulous that you accept every fringe theory that comes along, every claim of ancient astronauts or lost continents or advanced prehistoric civilizations, without critically examining the evidence. But you also don't want to be so wedded to orthodox interpretations that you dismiss legitimate anomalies and unexplained phenomena simply because they don't fit current models. The truth, whatever it is, probably lies somewhere between the extremes, in territory that requires both skepticism and openness, both rigor and imagination. What we can say with confidence is that human history is longer and more complex than the simplified versions presented in textbooks. Real history, the actual lived experience of countless generations, doesn't reduce to clean narratives with clear turning, points and obvious meanings. It's messy, contingent, full of false starts and dead ends and developments that seemed crucial at the time but turned out to be temporary. It's full of regional variations and local innovations that never spread widely, but mattered enormously to the people involved. It's full of knowledge that was developed and then lost, not through catastrophe necessarily, but through the ordinary processes of cultural change, where each generation makes choices about what to preserve and what to let go. And somewhere in that vast, messy, complex reality, there might be traces of things we haven't recognized yet. Civilizations that rose and fell, leaving few traces. Knowledge systems that were encoded in ways we haven't learned to read. Astronomical observations recorded in myths we've dismissed as fantasy. Architectural principles preserved in structures we've categorized as natural formations. We might be surrounded by evidence we don't recognize, walking past it daily, dismissing it as unimportant or misinterpreting it entirely. The past might be trying to speak to us in languages we haven't learned yet. Or maybe not. Maybe the timeline we have is basically correct, the narrative essentially sound, the evidence properly interpreted. Maybe there were no lost civilizations in deep prehistory, no forgotten ages of sophistication, no ancient knowledge waiting to be rediscovered. Maybe the Maya and Egyptians and other ancient peoples really were just that innovative, developing their astronomical and architectural knowledge independently, without needing to inherit it from earlier sources. Maybe the similarities between distant cultures reflect universal human tendencies, rather than cultural diffusion or shared heritage. Maybe the myths of golden ages are just what they appear to be, symbolic stories about moral decline rather than memories of literal historical periods. Both possibilities remain open. The evidence doesn't conclusively support either interpretation. We're left with uncertainty, with competing narratives, with the need to acknowledge that we might never know for sure, and that's okay. That's actually more honest than pretending to certainties we don't possess. The past is genuinely mysterious in places, genuinely uncertain, genuinely open to multiple interpretations. Admitting that doesn't weaken our understanding. It strengthens it by making it more accurate, more aligned with the actual state of evidence, less dependent on assumptions we can't fully justify. This is where contemplation becomes valuable in ways that pure analysis sometimes isn't. When you sit quietly with a question, not trying to force an answer, but just holding it gently, turning it over in your mind, considering different angles without committing to any particular conclusion, sometimes insights emerge that wouldn't come through more aggressive inquiry. Not definitive answers necessarily, but intuitions, hunches, directions worth exploring. The quiet space of contemplation allows for a different kind of knowing, one that complements rather than replaces rigorous analysis. And late at night, in the darkness, in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, contemplation comes naturally. The mind loosens its grip on the categories and definitions that structure daytime thinking. Boundaries become permeable. Distant ideas find unexpected connections. Questions that seemed intractable during the day reveal new dimensions, new ways of being approached. Nothing gets solved necessarily, but everything gets enriched, deepened, made more interesting by being viewed from this quieter, less demanding perspective. That's the state we've been inhabiting throughout this exploration. Not trying to prove anything or convince anyone, just wondering together about possibilities, sitting with uncertainties, letting the questions breathe. The past doesn't need us to understand it completely. It's content to remain partially mysterious, partially knowable, always slightly beyond our full comprehension. We're the ones who struggle with that, who want everything explained and categorized and settled. But maybe learning to be comfortable with not knowing is itself a kind of wisdom, a recognition of our proper place in the vast sweep of time, because we are small, ultimately, brief. Each individual life a flicker in the long history of humanity, and humanity itself a recent arrival in the even longer history of Earth, and Earth a tiny planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable part of a vast galaxy that's one among billions. That perspective could be crushing, could make everything seem meaningless, or it could be liberating, could free us from the burden of needing to have everything figured out, could allow us to simply participate in the ongoing story without needing to control or comprehend all of it. The ancient builders might have understood this better than we do. They built for timescales that dwarfed individual lives, working on projects that would take generations to complete, aligning structures with celestial cycles that would repeat long after they were gone. They thought in terms of deep time naturally, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a practical necessity. When your primary timepieces are the sun and stars, when your calendar is marked by seasons and solstices rather than numbers on a page, when the past lives in story rather than history books, you develop a different relationship with time. Less anxious, perhaps, less rushed, more patient with the slow unfolding of patterns that repeat on scales larger than any individual life. We've lost some of that. Our technology gives us precision but maybe costs us perspective. We can measure time to the nanosecond but struggle to think meaningfully about millennia. We have detailed records going back centuries but feel disconnected from the deeper past, from the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence before writing, before cities, before all the things we usually associate with civilization. That older world feels alien to us, primitive. difficult to relate to. But it was just as human, just as full of people living complete lives, loving and grieving and wondering and trying to make sense of their existence. And maybe, in that older world, there were moments of sophistication we haven't recognized, periods when conditions aligned to allow for complexity, for innovation, for the accumulation of a knowledge that would later be lost when circumstances changed. Not advanced in all the ways we are, perhaps, but advanced in their own ways, along different paths, prioritizing different capabilities. If we could somehow meet them, those ancient peoples, we'd probably find them both familiar and strange, recognizably human, but different enough to challenge our assumptions about what human civilization can look like. The conversation between past and present continues, whether we're conscious of it or not. Every archaeological discovery, every new interpretation of ancient texts, every reassessment of monuments we thought we understood, that's the conversation continuing, the past speaking and the present trying to listen and understand. It's an asymmetric conversation, to be sure. The past can't respond directly to our questions, can't correct our misunderstandings, can't tell us when we're getting it wrong. We're left to interpret silence, to read meaning into fragments, to construct narratives from incomplete evidence. But it's still a conversation, still a relationship, still a connection across time that enriches both parties. We're enriched by contemplating the past, by trying to understand where we came from and who came before and what they accomplished and how they thought. It gives us perspective, shows us different possibilities, reminds us that our way of doing things isn't the only way, might not even be the best way for all purposes, and maybe the past is enriched, too, in some strange sense, by being remembered, by having people still care about it thousands of years later, still try to understand it, still wonder about its mysteries. Memory is a form of life extension, a way for people and cultures to continue existing beyond their physical duration. As long as we remember, as long as we wonder, the past remains alive in some attenuated but real way. The questions we've been exploring tonight, about lost civilizations and forgotten knowledge and patterns that connect across vast distances and time, these aren't just academic exercises. They're part of that larger conversation, part of how we relate to our collective past, and try to understand our place in the long story of human existence. Whether there were earlier civilizations or not, whether the myths preserve real memories or not, whether the monuments encode ancient wisdom or not, the questioning itself has value. It keeps us engaged with the past, keeps us thinking about continuity and change, keeps us humble about how much we know and don't know. And as we come toward the end of this long, slow exploration, as sleep beckons and consciousness begins to fade, we can let these questions rest without needing to resolve them. They'll still be there tomorrow. The past will still be there, patient and mysterious, waiting for anyone who wants to look, to wonder, to engage. The conversation will continue with or without us. New discoveries will be made. New interpretations will be proposed. The timeline will continue to be adjusted as evidence accumulates. The story will keep getting richer, more complex, more interesting. Our role is just to pay attention when we can, to remain curious, to hold our conclusions lightly enough that we can revise them when necessary, to appreciate the genuine mysteries without needing to solve them all immediately, to acknowledge what we don't know without letting that not knowing become anxiety or frustration, to be comfortable with uncertainty, with ambiguity, with the recognition that some questions might remain open indefinitely. This is wisdom, perhaps. Not the wisdom of knowing all the answers, but the wisdom of knowing how to live with questions. The night has deepened into that special quiet that comes in the hours before dawn. The world feels suspended, held in a moment that could last forever or could dissolve in an instant. Your thoughts have become gossamer, barely there, more dream than waking consciousness. This is good. This is natural. This is the transition we've been moving toward all along, from active wondering to passive receptivity, from questions to quiet, from seeking to accepting. Let the past keep its mysteries. Let the questions remain unanswered. Let the patterns speak for themselves without demanding interpretation. The earth continues its patient work of preservation and erasure. The monuments continue standing, silent witnesses to knowledge we may never fully recover. The myths continue circulating, carrying meanings that shift with each retelling but never quite disappear. And we, brief participants in this ongoing story, transition from waking to sleeping, From wondering to dreaming, from engagement to rest, this is where we leave it. Not concluded, but suspended. Not resolved, but acknowledged. The past remains vast and largely unknowable, but present somehow in the very ground we walk on, in the stories we still tell, in the persistent human urge to understand where we came from. The questions remain open. The possibilities remain alive. The mystery endures, patient and deep, waiting for anyone who cares to approach it with curiosity and humility. Sleep well now. Let these thoughts dissolve completely, becoming nothing more than faint impressions that might linger into morning or might vanish entirely, leaving only a residual sense of having touched something larger than yourself, older than you can fully comprehend, more patient than any human. Timescale. The past will still be there when you wake. The questions will still be there. The wonder will still be there if you want it. But for now, rest. Dream. Let consciousness fade into that deeper darkness where questions don't need answers and mysteries don't need solutions. Until next time, this is Sleepy Luna, where history moves slowly and wonder unfolds in the darkness. Good night.